And welcome to this celebration of our book that we're launching today, entitled Women, Migration and Asylum in Turkey. I'm going to start today as one of the editors with a short discussion of why we wrote this book and what's contained in it. And then we're very lucky today to have three of the contributors. That's Professor Sanye, Dr. Reyhan and Emel are with Dr. Emel are with us now, two in Turkey at the moment, and Reyhan is in Humboldt in Berlin. So we came together to write this book after meeting up in a conference in 2017. And at that point, it was really clear that Turkey was going to be a central focus of migration flows and of policy and regulation for the Middle East, but also for the world in general. We were also very aware that the focus then was largely on Syrian flows into Turkey. And we felt it was really important, given our much longer experience of working with migration in Turkey, that something was written that reflected not just on the experience of women, but the experience of women asylum seekers, but also that focused on the broader and much more varied way that women have been migrating around Turkey for a long time. We're very lucky to have brought together contributors that have a long experience of working in this field. And through that, we were able to bring in a real kind of depth of knowledge about the variety of work, and also a very distinct feminist perspective through our empirical works and our approach to research that we feel was pretty unique. We wanted to look at women because women are very often, as we know, the objects of policy, and that women's voices are not heard as often as they should be, and that we felt there was a lot to be said about the way women migrate, but also the way women's migration is controlled and impacted by policies that are built without women in mind. So we wanted to redress that kind of gendered balance and put women's voices there. So as I said, when we started out on this research, most of the research coming out was very much about Syrian migration. That was the thing of the moment, and totally understandably so. But of the 3.6 million migrants, displaced people, should I say, who are now in Turkey, the largest number of any country in the world, there's not just Syrian people who are migrating. We know there are many other groups of people who are seeking asylum. There are many people from Iraq, from Afghanistan, from other countries who are also subject to very difficult policies often, and whose chances to get their aspirations is limited in many occasions. We're also very lucky to have people who've been working with particular groups of women. So I think this book is probably unique in actually taking the migration of African women seriously in Turkey. And that's a very important part of what we have in the book too. So there's theoretical chapters, there are chapters on the experiences of Syrian people, but there are also chapters discussing the issues of migrants not from a Syrian or even a displaced migration history. So we have people, we describe the experience also of women who have migrated for labor and who have voluntarily migrated to Turkey. Very importantly, I think, and we're very pleased that we've got this, we also have some what we call vignettes, which are short pieces, short passages written by migrant women themselves. And this was very important for us to allow women the chance to talk back to researchers, to policymakers, to politicians, and to get some agency and to recognize what they want and what they understand as being their needs. So I think just to say that's really all I want to talk about at the moment in introducing the book. But what we're going to do, I just wanted to talk a little bit through how things are going to go through the morning. I'm going to introduce the other speakers. Professor Sanye is going to start by giving her a little talk. Then we'll have Dr. Reyhan and Dr. Emel, and then we'll go from there. So the idea is, if there are questions of clarification after either of the speakers, please do write them in the Q&A and we can deal with those questions there and then. But generally, the idea here is to have a discussion between all of us. So let's save the questions to the end. Please write in the Q&A box. I'm going to try and keep my eye on what's coming up, and I will try to share out those questions as we go. Don't worry, we probably won't take the whole 2 hours we've got for this, but let's make it an open discussion as far as possible. So I think it's now time. Let's just go straight on to ask Sanya if you would come in and give your presentation. Thank you.
Hello, and I would like to start with thanking Lucy and Tanya for organizing this meeting for us and enabled us to come together and talk about our collective edited volume. And what I'm going to do this morning is just tell you a little bit about the chapter I have contributed to the book. I will try to give a brief overview of the chapter. And since I'm the first speaker, that maybe I can take the liberty to talk about just a few things about Syrian migration to Turkey. As we all know that since 2011, Turkey has been a host to a major Syrian refugee population, and their sudden influx has had really great social, economic, and cultural influence on Turkish society. And one of these direct impacts has been on labor markets, and Syrian refugees have emerged in Turkey as new precariat of Turkey. So what they need to do is to compete to grab the jobs that previously held by Turkish or Kurdish precariats in Turkey. So my chapter was really, based on this question that's trying to show a case of how Syrian refugees get access to one of these most precarious jobs in Turkey, namely seasonal agricultural work. So it also teases out the ways in which how women's labor is central in the organization of seasonal agricultural labor markets in Turkey. So therefore, in an examination of refugee Syrian women's work and labor, I focused on women's activities both in the realms of production and social reproduction, and how they combine in the specific work of seasonal agricultural production. So the chapter also tried to analyze the extent to which women's paid and unpaid activities have changed during the post-migration process, together with their engagement in seasonal agricultural work. So you may wonder what the seasonal agricultural work means. All these questions are based on. So when we talk about seasonal work in rural Turkey and its peculiar labor force, we usually talk about families traveling from their original place of residence to the regions where they can do farm work, and the farm work also takes place. And this work is usually team-based. It's the team. They base teams based on family ties. So in this respect, this labor market is not individually, or this work is not individually performed, but a team-based work. So the families travel together, and then they settle for a couple of months during the harvesting season to do the job. So they usually live in isolated tent camps, which is usually far from the city centers, and they usually locate near to the water canals. You can have some water. And the most of these worker families live in these tent camps all year around in the regions such as Adana, where agricultural production takes place all year. So a sense of agricultural work in this setting demands, it rarely demands any highly qualifications or skills, but workers with, limited mobility and lower skills are usually drawn into seasonal agricultural work when there is a rising, temporarily rising demand during the harvesting season. So usually the workers usually come from the southeast part of Turkey, from the cities. The major city is actually Şanlıurfa, Adıyaman, and Mardin. And in Turkish context, these workers are usually labeled as Easterners. In the earlier literature, we see an emphasis on Kurdish workers, but my experience with seasonal workers, it shows that there are different layers changing throughout the time. And in recent years, the immigrant workers coming from Syria, Georgia, and Azerbaijan have been dominating that work in some regions of Turkey. So what is also peculiar about this work is like women and children are an important component of this labor force. And this is actually, we can see this as an extension of nimble fingers debates, still alive in agriculture too. So I think it will be suffice to say that women are generally take part in agricultural work, not as individuals, but the agricultural work is an extension of their family-based duties. They conceptualize or see it like this. So my work in the chapter was like examination of the situation of Syrian refugee women living in these tent areas in rural Turkey and doing the farm work with their families. So maybe I should just talk a little bit about the field work I have been doing on this, with seasonal agricultural workers, and how I collected my data. Since I think it's been like 5 years now, I have been part of a number of different research projects aiming to analyze the different aspects of seasonal agricultural work, like immigrant labor, child labor, labor intermediaries, wage system, worker household structures. So I conducted also extended surveys with Syrian households working as seasonal agricultural workers. So to write this current chapter that I'm talking about, I mostly utilized the findings from a large-scale survey. I think it's one of the largest in Turkey in terms of focusing on a specific group of Syrians, which took place in Adana in 2016. And the questionnaire reached 266 Syrian households, and it covers over 1,500 Syrian individuals. So it's pretty good large-scale survey. And I think that survey gave us to have a little bit, a few words on how particular the Syrian population we studied, because, they had large household composition, a family was composed with 6 people or more, and the young age composition was one of the other striking features of this sample. And rural background and lower education levels, all this information is in the chapter, I should say. And maybe I will just focus on my conclusions, what the chapter is trying to, or what it is coming out of all this study. I think the main finding is that the time women spend on paid and unpaid work has increased greatly after they migrate to Turkey. And we see increasing number of women are engaged in agricultural production, and there is a need for them to work longer hours in all these domestic chores and caring activities as well. And it is clear in our chapter that while migrant women provide cheap labor to agricultural sector of Turkey, they also have no control over their wages they earn. Their wages are usually sized as a result of established patriarchal system in the family. So their not only their wage, but also their labor is highly controlled by the male dominant organization of agricultural paid labor. So we see that disproportionate exploitation of women's labor, not only by their families, but the communities they belong, and also by their employers, which is another finding that we discussed in the chapter. So we see that the existing patriarchal relations practiced in, in this setting foster the subordination of women and exert a control over their labor and bodies. Maybe I should conclude by saying that migrant women have become the most privileged, underprivileged group in our society, because they have to, face harsh working and living conditions of seasonal agricultural work, which reproduces the poverty and social exclusion of these groups. And, which groups that undertake these jobs, regardless of their ethnic, cultural origins or the nationality of the workers, I think this is like, the chapter is basically about telling a story of, how this race to bottom is taking place in this very specific location in Turkey. Thank you. I think, I hope I finished on time. So I'll be answering the questions if there is any. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanya. That was really clear. And Sanya's work is really interesting example of digging deeply into one specific group and experience of one group of women, and a very large sample. And I should have said before that another of what I think are the strengths of the book is that the contributors come from very different multidisciplinary backgrounds. So Sanya, I believe you're a labor economist. We have economists, we have political scientists and sociologists who've all been part of the story. On reflecting on Sanya's work with Syrians, there's another chapter in the book that's looking at the experience of women who left Syria with actually high skills, who are well qualified and had much work experience when they were in Syria, but in Turkey, they also find themselves working in similarly precarious positions and really experiencing a great deal of underemployment. So unless there are any quick questions for clarification, I'd like to move straight on to Reyhan, who will introduce herself and is going to talk about her research and her contribution to the book. Thank you, Reyhan.
Hello and hi to everyone. Thank you first I would like to thank Lucy and Tanya really for organizing this wonderful event, and so that we can speak about the book that I also a bit contribute to. But I think the collective picture is more important, that different scientists taking from different angles the issue of Syrian women migrants in Turkey. On my part, I just contribute to the side on a chapter that's focused on welfare state responses and social workers' attitudes towards Syrian immigrants in Turkey. So before I get into what I try to do in the chapter, I just give some background information, although Sanya Hoca gave already some, but I just want to clarify something because this will be a general framework for my problematization of the issue. Yeah, so it's nearly 10 years. It's been nearly 10 years that Syrians are fleeing from war. And yes, we have 3.6 million, but the fact is that actually there are 5.5 million Syrian refugees. And these refugees mostly come to Turkey, yes. But the others actually go to other neighboring countries of Syria, which are Lebanon and Jordan. And nearly less than 20% of those Syrians could make it to Europe as asylum seekers. And this wave actually has been cut down with the coronavirus, of course. So it's now the Syrian refugees are most in a way stuck in the neighboring countries that they are in. And also the war is still, somehow continuing. And this actually creates a challenge for neighboring countries and also for the European ones as well, in the junction point of protection of human rights, because those people are fleeing from war, so they have to be protected under the human rights law. And of course, it's one junction point is protection of human rights, and the other junction point is, of course, economy, which is even getting worse with this COVID-19 issue. But the cost of how we will deal with refugees, has always been on the agenda. And then, of course, there is the other junction point, which is the politics of identity, because for every welcoming country who is coming towards, change how it is perceived and how the country is actually, oh, I'm so sorry for this, how the countries react to the migration influxes. And in this context, the relation between the migration policy, the welfare state of the host countries and refugees is very challenging for both sides, because most of the times refugees cannot reach to the labor market, as Professor Saniye pointed well. Some are in the rural areas and some work in the agricultural sector, but actually the majority are in the urban areas, and they are working in informal sector, or basically they are unemployed, which means they are deprived of any kind of income source. In this case, reaching to the welfare state options like social assistance become an issue of life and death even. So it become a mechanism of survival for much of the refugees around the world, as well as in Turkey. So in this case, how welfare regimes react to the migrants become very critical. And then, of course, the welfare regimes are basically designed for serving to citizens, and migrants are people that are not citizens, and they have kind of a lesser rights, a group with lesser rights. So should they serve to the migrants? How long should they serve to? Which stationary services should be open to the migrants? Are all points of discussion. And of course, welfare systems are not, perfect, not all rights-based. And so they have very tricky political aspects within it. For example, gender regimes, how the state is thinking of family, what are the conditionalities for social assistance, for example, kinship regimes, how the state is trying to regulate the kinship regimes, work orientation, family orientation, how much of the subsistence or care services are expected from the family, how much of it are perceived as social rights and provided within the welfare regime. So these are all, things. And plus there is also the political issue of patriarchal and democratic approach of the states, which means that how elastic welfare states are with respect to demands of social groups, with different demands of social groups, like women or like migrants, for example. So in this case, migration poses challenges in all these areas, in gender, political identity, formation, and also labor market policies. In all these areas, introducing a non-citizen group, a group of people with lesser rights as consumers and lesser rights as workers, and also most of the times with distinct gender and kinship regimes and different cultural and political attitudes. So it is a very complex issue for the welfare state in a way, to welcome and organize migratory issues. So the case of Syrian immigrant women fleeing from war to Turkey is very interesting in this case because of their imminent situation, so to say. And I try to problematize this relation according to this relation between welfare state and refugees, with a special focus on the role of the social workers. Most Syrian asylum seekers are being hosted in countries like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, as I say. And these countries have patriarchal cultures, which have some commonalities with some part of Syria. But they all have weak welfare states, which means that their sources are limited, and they have partial democracies, which means that the welfare state cannot easily react to the demands of the masses. Rather, it's strictly controlled by the central state. So these countries are all ranked among the lowest 15 countries of the global gender gap, which means the situation welcoming the migrants are not very gender friendly, which makes it even harder for Syrian women in all these neighboring countries. And in the democracy index, they are classified as hybrid or authoritarian, which means it's not easy to advocate for the rights. So also the weak welfare regime also denotes here that small scale, temporary, limited, and non-rights-based public institutionalization of welfare services, which is a common point between Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, the three countries actually who are hosting now the largest refugee population among the world. So the large refugee influx challenge welfare regimes of these countries neighboring to Syria in terms of protection of refugees, human rights, as I say, and monetary and human costs of providing appropriate welfare services. So but on the other hand, for most refugees, the first challenge after taking refuge in a country is connecting and accessing to the welfare system. Getting access to shelter, to safety, to health, to education services, to basic social aid is a matter of survival for most of the refugees who have limited financial and social resources. And this becomes even more difficult as their stay here gets longer and longer. Maybe in a way during the first years of this migration, when everybody was more concentrated on refugee camps, which is actually not a favorable place for living, of course, but it is a concentrated area, and providing some social services may be easier when there is a limited population actually being in a limited place, so that it may be easier. But as time goes by, more and more people come, and actually the camps were not enough, and also were not the favorable option, as I say. So now more than 90% of the Syrians are in urban and rural areas in various cities of Turkey, which means that less than 10% are in camp, which also means that the welfare system and the labor market within the cities are actually the sites for Syrian women and also all migrants in Turkey now for survival. So from the welfare provider's side, on the other hand, meeting the needs of refugees in socially and financially acceptable terms may be problematic, because there is also public that they are not always very favorable about welcoming refugees, which is the case in Turkey is a bit in the middle. Some people are very pro-Syrian migrants because they understand that they are fleeing from war. Some religious people are for them because they think that they are their religious brothers. Some more leftist and secular people are also for them because they see what's going on, the war, and they are for human rights, and they say yes, they can come. But also there are some people who say that, well, there are limited social services in Turkey, limited job options in Turkey, and now we have to share this with Syrians, and we are not very happy about this. So there is also this, this thing going on in the public sphere. The state also wants to manage this situation. And yeah, so it is problematic on the Turkish side. So in the concrete example of Turkey, which is, securing human rights and the welfare of 3.6 million Syrian refugees, we have to say that is a real challenge. So this challenge actually brings about a policy response that come with a lot of arbitrariness in protection, we might say. So what I mean by this is this basic law, which is governing the Syrian population, introduces temporary protection, which means that we are protecting them. They are entitled to certain things, but for a limited time. And actually, this limited time is not defined. So this brings about lots of arbitrariness on the side of Syrian immigrants, because they cannot see whether their residence rights or access to health and social services or limited work permits, how long all these will endure, they cannot foresee. And so the duration of this protection status is not clear, and this in return gives rise to, yes, certain arbitrariness under temporary protection, and increases the precarious situation of Syrian migrants in Turkey. So within this general picture, while Syrian migrants are facing uncertainty, the social workers really become key actors in enabling their reach for social services and maybe for labor market in the urban areas. So social workers are a key for all those welfare state and labor market things. Therefore, I suggest that social workers' position can be problematized as the human facade of the welfare system, because actually they are the initial point of getting in touch with the welfare system. And social workers' position also is very much in between refugees and under different legal refugees, under very different legal statuses in Turkey, because there are not only Syrian refugees under temporary protection, there are Afghanis who are applied for asylum but couldn't get a result yet. There are also some other irregular migrants and so on. So with different legal statuses, different migrants. So the social workers have all these as their clients, so to say. So these are on one side, but on the other side, there is the welfare system, so which gives them some rights, but also limited. And also there are conditionalities, which can be really very complex for a migrant to understand. So they really need some, assistance at that point. And then there are also some institutional obligations, because there are always written rules and oral rules in our institutions, so that something can be allowed up to a certain point, maybe up to a certain number of migrants and so on. So they also have to balance this. And of course, there is their universally accepted professional and values, and also there are their personal values. So in a way, they are surrounded with all these limitations and obligations. And in this case, when we situate social workers in such an analytical framework, then how they perceive migrants and how they behave as professionals become really important in this actual practice of welfare state and social rights of the migrants within every country and also in Turkey. So in my chapter, I dwell on this problematization, try to put the social workers in such an analytical framework, and in a way, with a qualitative research, try to understand how social workers perceive Syrian immigrants, and especially Syrian women immigrants in Turkey, how they get into a dialogue between them, and how they try to balance with this, professional values, the limited welfare state system, the institutional structure, and the imminent demands of the refugees, how they try to balance it. And in this, I especially problematize in the chapter the importance of empathy as a professional social worker, so that I think the right use of empathy would make social workers more sensitive for understanding refugees' situation, and hence increase their intensive for effectivity in making all these connections and trying to assist Syrian migrants in Turkey to use their rights. So that was the basic thing of the chapter. So as last words, I think last 1 minute, I guess. Okay, let's go to the conclusion. So one of the conclusion is that professional values are very important, but also gender plays a real role, both for social workers and also for on the side of Syrian migrants, in perceiving one another, in getting into dialogue with one another, and therefore in using or not using welfare services, as well as revealing or not revealing gender-based problems such as domestic violence and so. So more of it you can find in the chapter. I think my contribution to hold the book's discussion about Syrian migrants in Turkey from different angles of social sciences was a bit on this dwelling on social workers' perceptions on the issue. Well, if there will be questions, I will be answering them in the Q&A part. For now, thank you for listening. Now the word is yours, Lucy.
Thank you very much, Reyhan. That was an excellent discussion of your chapter, and I think fits very nicely with what Sanya was saying of the group of relatively isolated Syrians working in agricultural areas and other Syrians in the cities who are reliant on welfare services. I'm also very struck by the applicability of your work, Reyhan, with social workers to every other place where refugees are settling, because wherever we are, it's social workers are very often the sharp edge between the migrant and their agency and the state and the desire to control or whatever the state policy happens to be. And I would also say Reyhan's chapter's got lots of quotations from social workers and is very interesting in that respect. So for our final contributor is Emel, and I think Emel's going to speak about non-Syrian migrants, if we can call them that, and talk about a broader group of migrants who are also living and getting by in Turkey. Thank you very much, Emel.
Thank you, Lucy. And thank you, Tanya, for your technical support. And thanks to the Brussels School of International Studies, because this panel has a different meaning for me, as I did my PhD at the University of Kent. So my previous research covers different fields of migration and gender issues in Turkey, such as migration policy, labor markets, asylum system, as in the book chapter, and trafficking in women. So today I will try to give you a brief picture of how gender factors shape women's migration experiences in Turkey, with a reference to my previous research with Ugandan women. As we know, feminist research has shown us that gender is centrally important in women's migration, and that gender relations and inequalities affect women's decisions and processes differently than men. In fact, migration can mean escaping from patriarchal relations and institutions such as marriage, but also can mean fulfilling gender roles, like taking care of children. So women's migration is also affected by structural factors. For example, Sassen points out the link between the negative effects of neoliberal economic policies on developing countries and informal global economies in which women's labor is demanded as domestic workers, low-waged workers in gendered segments of the labor market, or as prostitutes. In fact, feminization of migration is defined as one of the trends in international migration, in which globalization and changing international division of reproductive labor play an important role. So we can see this trend clearly in the demand of migrant women's labor in Western countries, especially in Europe. Women's participation in waged work without any significant change in the gender division of labor in the home, combined with the gradual disappearance of the welfare state and aging society and the marketization of care, also help to increase the demand of chief domestic labor, namely migrant women's labor. So when we look at Turkey, there is also a high demand for migrant women's labor. Current research show us that most migrant women do gendered, poorly paid and dirty jobs which are unwanted by local women. And the reason behind this demand is also related to migrant women's reputation as hardworking and easily controllable and therefore exploitable workers, as well as employers' expectation for sexual relations also. So taking the example of Ugandan women, my research shows that economic and structural factors such as impoverishment of women in Uganda, they're having less access to the labor market, as well as patriarchal relations and gendered responsibilities affect women's decisions of migration. So these responsibilities can include taking care of their children or family members, or a need to build a house or to save some money to get married in Uganda, actually. So other research also shows similar gendered reasons for women's migration from neighboring countries, such as Erdar and Kaşka's research. So this is one side, and the other side, when we look at the way of migration of women, there is also the ways are also shaped by gendered factors. As women have less access to economic resources, they don't have enough money to cover their migration journey. So they usually rely on mediators, employment agencies or travel agencies to cover their migration expenses. For example, most Ugandan women I met in Istanbul or in Kampala, they had to borrow, or they were willing to borrow money from either their relatives or money lenders or agencies. Sometimes even the opportunity of borrowing money can help women to make their decisions. For example, the agencies in Uganda could affect women's decisions about where to go. They present Turkey or Saudi Arabia or other countries as destinations for better opportunities. Even my research show that women didn't know anything about Turkey before approaching to these agencies. They thought that Turkey was a member of European Union, even so they could go to the UK or any other European countries. So these agencies organize the whole migration process, such as visa application, other documents, as well as plane tickets. And then women are expected to pay back their debt with an interest rate to those agencies or to their friends when they start working in Turkey. So it's such a profitable business that even migrant women themselves make profit out of this, business of bringing women into Turkey. So when we look at the end of their journey, when women arrive in Turkey, there are also different gender mechanisms affect them. First of all, they become undocumented as soon as they arrive Turkey within like 2 weeks, because it's a result of Turkey's strict control over migration. For example, a migrant can access a work permit through an employer after having a 6 months resident permit, which requires some documents such as private health insurance or a bank account. So it's quite difficult for a woman who has no economic resources. In terms of this work permits, maybe applying for a domestic job through an employer could be an exception, because there is a high demand for domestic workers and the government relatively facilitates these permits. However, in general, applying for a work permit is a long and bureaucratic process, and employers usually are not willing to apply to those permits because of the burden on them. So therefore, most migrant women remain undocumented, which means they consent to work in poor conditions and without a social security, under the pressure of saving some money and also being deported. They also become more dependent on their employers in Turkey and the mediators in general. So Ugandan women present a typical example of how migrant women become undocumented in Turkey, as they become undocumented in 15 days when they arrive here with a business visa, which was the only available option to women to come to Turkey. So when they become undocumented, their freedom of movement is restricted, and they start to fear of deportation, and become more dependent on mediators and employers. And their relationship with the mediators and other agencies or employers also shape their working conditions in Turkey. Some of these mediators also take some measures to make sure that migrant women pay their debt in time or stay in those jobs they found themselves. Sometimes they keep their passports, sometimes push them into exploitative jobs or into prostitution, actually. And some of these cases were even similar to sex trafficking. So my research showed that most Ugandan women feel under pressure to pay their debt and send money back home. So they try to do whatever it takes to earn money. Their motivation were very high because they feel that they cannot go back home with empty hands. So it usually takes years to save, some money with those low wages. Therefore, women usually give up their personal needs, social life, and they just try to survive to save some money. For example, last week I talked to a friend from Uganda who's been living in Turkey, in Istanbul, for the last 7 years. And she's a qualified textile worker, actually. Even she said that she was standing all day long while she was working in a small textile atelier without a lunch provided by the employer and no social security for sure. But she had to consent to work in these conditions because most of the ateliers were closed during pandemic, and maybe actually it's probably worse for domestic migrant workers. We don't have any research about this yet. So when we look at the working conditions of migrant women, there are some similarities, and they are also shaped by their gender and in general gendered factors and undocumented position of women in Turkey. We see that migrant women usually work in isolated areas and are in gender jobs without any social security, and they usually get lower wages than local workers and often face arbitrary firing. Furthermore, in case of any complaint about labor exploitation or sexual harassment to the authorities, their undocumented position usually takes over, takes priority and prevents them from seeking justice and eventually may result in deportation. So considering all these gendered factors and difficulties, migrant women usually find themselves discriminated against and limited in their options. Their undocumented position and migration regime make women easily exploited and sexually harassed migrants. However, it doesn't mean that women do not actively take decisions. On the contrary, they try to build their own strategies and networks to survive in these difficult conditions. In fact, also, like, there are success stories of migrant women as they pay for their children's education, as they help to their relatives or build their own houses back in their hometowns. So these also have positive effects on other women's migration decisions. As a conclusion, it can be said that gendered factors shape women's migration journey from the beginning until the end. Sometimes their return is also related to their gender roles. But most importantly, of course, Turkey's restrictive migration regime discriminates migrant women as it drives them into insecure and exploitative positions in the gendered segments of the labor market. Their position also creates the demand for migrant women's labor. So this migration and gender regimes serve to keep women silent against any violation of human rights and against sexual harassment. Therefore, gender-sensitive policy and protection mechanisms must be designed for migrant women, as Reyhan said, which may include an easy access to resident and work permit too. So migrants can protect themselves better against any kind of violation of their basic human rights. And also policy against sexual and gender-based violence are also necessary to save basic human rights of migrant women and women's rights also. Thank you, Lucy. For now, I think I can finish and we can continue with questions and answers. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Emel. That was really interesting. And your work with undocumented women is really interesting. And I encourage all of you out there to have a look at some of the things Emel's been doing on both trafficking and working with different groups of women. I think it's really important what Emel was saying there about how it's policy itself that's made a lot of women vulnerable, that women who arrived with an idea of what they were going to do and with lots of skills end up being made vulnerable as they become undocumented, and that sometimes even policies that are designed to support migrant women can end up feeling like control. And we've not spoken a huge amount about asylum seeking women, but I think that's very much the case of women who are in the asylum system rather than the temporary protection system that Reyhan and Senye spoke about, because they are very much controlled by all sorts of different policies in Turkey. But we have a question here from Boyan, which I'm just reading for the first time here. He says, thank you, everything. It is for a beautifully theorized and empirically researched volume. Well, yes, absolutely, of course it is. And he's saying he's enjoying the empirical work here. And I think that is something that we tried to do very much in the book, is to bring forward all the different kinds of empirical work that's around there. And as I said earlier, there are chapters there that sort of focus in on all kinds of different places where migrant women are living and the experiences that they're going through. We don't actually have any questions per se, but what I would like to ask everybody, just to get everything kicked off a little bit, is to think maybe about if any of you, Sanya, Reyhan or Emel, have any ideas about how you think policy in Turkey could be reformed to counter some of these problems that you've described so far. How can policy change so that women become more able to exert their agency and to find better protection within the system? Would any of the three of you like to contribute some ideas about how migrant women could be protected better by the state and what should change? Any volunteers? We do have a question now, so shall we ask a question? This is from Maria. So did migrant women have specific proposals or suggestions for establishing a system and its policies? So and I think she's writing here about the women themselves. Did the women have an interest in changing the system, or did they just want to access the welfare state as it is? And what kind of opportunity is there to organize some kind of formal or informal associations? So I think maybe if, I think we've certainly got, I'm sure that Emel can speak about formal and informal associations, but I'm wondering if Sanya or Reyhan would like to speak about the women in their studies, if they had any suggestions for how they would like to see their situation change. Reyhan, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, maybe we can think both of the questions together. I mean, your question and the other Maria's question together, because I think they more or less point to the same issue. So we have a problematical situation and what could be done to, in a way, better women's situation here in this picture. Well, first of all, I think anyone shouldn't be writing prescriptions. So yes, there should be a lot to do about how to connect welfare system and migrant women in Turkey. But the ideas should come from the grassroots. The migrant women, Syrian migrant women and non-Syrian migrant women themselves, and also movement in Turkey. And also social workers who are, doing practice and actually who are in day-to-day interaction with migrants. So, so far, women's movement in Turkey already has some policy suggestions, and migrant women organizations and some informal migrant NGOs, because it's hard for them to be formal most of the times, have some. One of the things is that the more clarified legal status, but I think this will be very hard to get, honestly, but a more clear definition of time and rights and so on, or even getting the refugee status officially, not the temporary protection. So this actually this has been on the agenda for the last 3 or 4 years, but we'll see. I'm not so really hopeful about that part. But it's a special focus on women. I think we have to underline certain things that. But domestic violence is a common problem between Turkish and migrant women together. Precarious working conditions in the informal sector is also a common problem between, migrant and citizen women in Turkey. Of course, migrants are more prone to the disadvantages of, informal labor market and so on. And of course, they are more prone again to domestic violence, because at least citizen women, for them, it's more easy to get to the anti-violence NGOs, to women NGOs, because everybody is speaking Turkish. Try to find a neighbor, try to go to the social work system and so on. But of course, migrants first, it's not only a language barrier, it is also a trust barrier. So they have to trust to do first they have to know where is the social worker to go in case of a domestic violence, and then they need trust. And it's not only trust that even that social worker would listen to me, it is the trust that whether the system would really offer me a situation, a new position, some protection that will endure and give me some freedom from the family violence, not just for 1 or 2 days, but as a permanent solution. So that kind of trust is really, it is what is really needed. So that's one thing. And also the third issue is, of course, working conditions. Well, I mean, Turkey's informal sector has been on the agenda for longer than decades. Everybody knows that, in textile sector, in agriculture, in many, small shops in the urban areas, most of the people are working undocumented, unregistered. And there are wage gaps between registered and non-registered, and also within gender, and so on. But some of these things, I think what would be really powerful is to try to ground some, discussion environments between citizens and migrants all together. And try to talk about, common problems all together, and try to advocate about the solutions of those, grassroots suggested solutions of those common problems all together. So that's what I think.
Thank you, Reyhan. Sanye, would you like to contribute anything?
Yeah, I just want to say a few words. Thank you, Reyhan. At least you summarized the situation in the labor market, but I will make a few notes. The voice from the fields that I was, when I was doing my field work, and I was, I kept asking questions about this marriage, the documentation of marriage certificates, and how women feel about Turkish women. And, many of you probably know that in Turkey, women are facing the erosion of their social rights and, all these legislative rights that we based on. But what Syrian women were voicing in the field, what they said in quotes, that we would like to have the same rights as Turkish women have. So, this is, I think it's quite important to work on, the rights-based approach. Reyhan talked about, the temporariness of temporary protection situation that Syrians have or other migrants, have in Turkey. So this would be one of the areas that we can really work and further that into maybe better integration options. I think in Turkey so far, all the authorities dealt with Syrians as a humanitarian response, in terms of, providing stable rights or stable access to different entitlements. Still will be in the agenda in the coming maybe decades, not in a few years, will be on the probably agenda for coming decades. Any other things that, I'm not going to say anything about this informal work, as Reyhan really perfectly summarized that it's been on the agenda for many years. So I think we are going to face that. It is going to stay there for many years to come. Because, as we all know, the Turkey's economy is based on really this labor-intensive sector. So it's really difficult to formalize and to switch the informal production to formal one, as Emel's research also shows that how, African women are engaged in textile factories or textile ateliers in Istanbul. So maybe I will have another round after this one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sanye. Emel, do you have something to add on the formal and informal associations and migrant women's group? Because I know you've been have a long-term involvement in those kind of groups.
Yes, I just like to add something about the visibility of migrant women in general, because of their undocumented position or because of being like asylum seeker in Turkey, and because of their informal working conditions and isolated areas. Women are not really visible in public spaces for sure, but also their voice are really weak that we cannot hear them. And also this women's organizations like NGOs and foundations, any other like solidarity networks. Also, I was a member of one of these networks, but these organizations are also not really cannot work in this field because they don't have enough resources, and they usually get funding from international organizations or governmental bodies. So now, because of like Syrian refugee women and their problems, they become more visible, and slowly like women's organizations also working in this field. But undocumented workers, migrants, they are not still like visible because they are not like legally stay in Turkey, so they don't have any rights anyways. So that's important obstacle. And as we know, like Turkey has signed every single international convention against violence against women. Lastly, it was Istanbul Convention, and also one of the articles in this convention says that migrant women, relatively of their legal status, they can claim asylum in Turkey because of domestic violence or any kind of gendered violence. So, but we cannot see this in practice. So there are like policy that should be applied in daily life, but we cannot see these policies being practiced. So we also, like Turkish women in Turkey, like citizen women, also have big issue of domestic violence. So it's a kind of like priority of the women's organizations. Also, they are really busy with working against the general like violence against women, gendered violence. So we need some policies which should adopt like zero tolerance to any kind of gendered violence against women, irrelatively of their legal status, either citizens or migrants, doesn't matter, but they should be able to go through this any kind of like complaint. There is no institution, first of all, to go. Most women, they go directly to the police, and they are questioned because of their undocumented position. That's the like main difficulty in this area. So gender sensitive policy, maybe some like civil organizations for undocumented women or refugee women or asylum seeker women, and they should be able to find like a place to go through. In this process, maybe NGOs could be really useful, but they are really busy with their own agendas and in general like women's issues. So it's not really easy to build a gender sensitive policy and practice against the violence against migrant women, and of course violation of labor rights and human rights in general.
Thank you very much, Emel. We've got a perfect follow-on question for this one from Toral, who writes, what role do you think that actors such as donor states or the UN, who have a mandate to support the Turkish government in migration management, what role could these actors play in supporting women migrants? Would anybody like to take up that one? So that's specifically asking about the role of donor states who have a mandate on some of these issues. Rayhan?
Maybe I can, give some information about this. I mean, UN institutions are actually quite active in Turkey in migration management. They are actually partners in big projects with the EU funds, which actually helps some, at least, for migration management. And like UNFPA, like ILO, and like IOM, actually, they have field offices in especially cities that are high migrant population, that have high migrant population, like Gaziantep, for example, especially southeastern regions of Turkey, which are very close to Syria, you see. Some even have some social work centers. Some have migrant info hubs. Actually, we made an evaluation of the migrant info hubs 2 years ago, just before the COVID-19. And so these places are also very important for getting connected to the migrants in the urban areas, and those migrants getting connected to some welfare services provided by the UN agencies, as well as by the public social services and by municipalities and local governments as well. So they really have a critical role in the implementation of the policy. They also have a critical, but not so much determining, so to say, role in the making of migration and integration, so to speak, policy. But after COVID-19, of course, most of these centers are closed now. And so we need to do some research or reporting to see how they try to continue with their connections with the migrants, or is it totally a breakdown? I don't think that it's a total breakdown. Of course, the info hubs are somehow working, at least by phone, most probably. But we have to see it. Yeah, for now, it's okay, I guess.
Sani, do you have any suggestions for donors? No?
No, thank you. I will pass that one.
It's not really your thing, is it? Emel, do you have a kind of wish list that you think that international donors could get involved in to encourage some of the support you've been talking about for migrant women?
Yes, maybe we can say something like they have the power, they have the money, they are able to fund, most of the NGOs for sure, and they are able to support the government with migration policy and technical support too. So they have the power of this, supporting. However, I mean, we can only see Syrian refugees in general and registered asylum seekers, because I think all the NGOs, they should be, keep their records or provide social and economic support to registered asylum seekers. That's why they cannot expand their social services to to the other groups of migrants, especially undocumented migrants. So that's a problem of providing these services. And some NGOs, they support undocumented migrants with some basic things, but it's not enough. And there are only few NGOs, who do this. I think they are able to, they should be able to do more than the actual, services providing right now. And it's a kind of choice of, policy, like they can choose to which groups they could provide services. And so it's not about because local NGOs, they don't have enough funding. We have many cases, for example, especially now with this pandemic period, some domestic workers who had COVID positive, been fired from their jobs, and they don't have any place to go. So there is no like shelter for migrant women who had been through this violence, gendered violence, or any this kind of like emergency situation. So it's important to provide like a urgent basic services like shelters for the asylum seeker women too, for other undocumented women too who've been through this gender-based violence. Maybe we can say first without relatively like their legal status. I think there are basic support that can be provided as urgent services. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emel. That's a great, interesting answer. I think it's back to you again, though, Emel, for this next one. This is a question from Chipo, who asks how much of migrant women identity as Black women, and I think Chipo is thinking particularly of the Ugandan women here, is how much of their identity is influenced because of their identity and their experience. So, Emel, I wonder if you could speak basically about being Black and a migrant woman in
yeah, I mean that's for sure. Most sub-Saharan African women are discriminated because of their race too. They are much visible in public spaces. And for example, 2-3 years ago, I talked to a woman, Ugandan woman, who was working for a family in Ankara, the capital of Turkey. So she said she had been out for like 6 months. Normally, like domestic migrant workers, they go out once a week or twice a week. But as they have like different color of skin, so these employers also, some of them don't let them out to be visible. That's first thing. And the second, maybe among other migrants at their like workplaces, because of their race, they are at the bottom of the hierarchy among migrants. And even other migrants, like from neighboring countries who have similar cultural background to Turkey, sometimes who speak Turkish well. So they also, see them as they see them as like prior to their position, and they can order them to do, dirty jobs at the same workplace. So in public spaces, usually they are, discriminated. They are also discriminated at workplaces, but also among, migrants too.
Right. Okay, I'm just looking at Chipo's put the follow-up question here. Chipo says, I am a social worker, so interested in the role of social workers in this. So this brings in you, Rehan. And Chipo would like to know about any thoughts you have about trauma-informed practice and how that could enhance work with migrant women.
Okay. Well, I guess this especially can go for migrant women with domestic violence problems. In some of the info hubs that I, talked about before, they also, not all, but some of them also have special counseling for domestic violence cases. But it's not available in every city. This one was just available in 2 of these cities that we went. And of course, it's important to, realize the trauma-informed care. First is to realize the trauma, recognize the trauma, respond to the trauma, and resist to re-traumatization. But if it's this case for, again, domestic violence, first there has to be a way to get the women, and most of the times, yes, the children with her, out of home, which actually is a very big problem because shelter is one of the biggest problems for migrant populations. In some cases, they can stay in public shelters, but in this case, the social worker has to be, really skillful in order to, go into the bureaucracy and make this arrangement. So it is legally possible, but it is not so easy to achieve. And yes, once again, the social workers have a very important role in, connecting women, migrant women, and welfare services. Yeah.
Thank you, Rehan. I mean, I think that kind of answer really sounds very much like social workers in most places. I mean, certainly in Britain, there are many of these services available if you can be directed towards them. So that's a common problem. And that's even before we talk about all the issues about what are the appropriate services for trauma and how can we work in trauma-informed ways with people who have different cultural backgrounds and who have very different migration experiences and who are, as you've all described very well, in living in really temporary situations, sort of under fear of being returned to their country of origin or of losing the few rights that they have. I think, does anybody have any kind of further points just to wrap up? I think we're coming to an end of the discussion. Would anyone like to venture any concluding thoughts? I think it's been a really interesting discussion. Anyone got anything to say to wrap up? Okay, well, I'd like to wrap up then by saying thank you very much to everybody who's been on the line, and you'll all be getting, everybody who registered will be getting an email with the recording, with a link to the recording, and also we'll be giving information about the 20% discount we have from Palgrave. Please do ask your libraries to get the book, and hopefully that we can discuss these things further and take these issues on board. Okay, thank you very much, and lovely to see my dear friends and colleagues in Turkey, and shame that we weren't able to meet up in April in Brussels, which was the original plan, but there you go. All right, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Lucy.
Oh, we missed the last question.
Oh, are we leaving or staying for?
We were going to have a quick chat, I think, weren't we? Or
I think we closed the session. So last question was, and half of the people already left. By the way, thank you very much, Lucy, for wonderful presentations and wrapping up and arranging all this and everything.
well, thank you, Tanya. Where are you, Tanya? Are you there still?
And yes, Tanya, thank you. We couldn't see.
Tanya is listening to the radio.
Nice.